Hello and welcome back to another update. It is your host Kupiansk, and in this one there are numerous advances across the front line, where advances ranging from the 1st of December to the 5th of December are covered. The Russians managed to advance within the Vovchansk section of the front line through the town of Lyman in the northern section. Russians also managed to advance to the southeast of Kupiansk, while the Ukrainians managed to advance within Kupiansk and the southern parts of the city. To the southeast of this, the Russians and the Ukrainians are clashing in an area that was previously uncontested. What we see is footage of a Ukrainian counterattack on Russian positions that were not previously reported, so we added a gray zone in that direction. As for the southeast of this, the Russians advance in the direction of Siversk and to the northwest of it, in between Lyman and Siversk. To the southwest of this, the Russians managed to advance to the northeast of Minerat and Pokrovsk, as well as south of Minerat and the north of Pokrovsk. In addition to this, additional advances within Ivanivka, where the Russians countered the Ukrainian counterattack, leaving the town contested between the Russians and the Ukrainians. And finally, the Russians advanced further within the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line with a Ukrainian flank operation, making the situation unclear in that section of the front line. Starting out in the southern section of the front line within Zaporizhzhia, the Russians managed to advance further within the town of Ivanivka, getting control of the fortifications on the northern outskirts of the town and some forest lines to the east of it. As for the flag operations, the Ukrainians raised the flag with 3 soldiers here in the farm area in the northern parts of Dobropilya. I went to Deep State Maps Telegram where they were discussing it. They said that the Ukrainians were showing blah 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 blah. They were raising the flag. Then all of the comments were saying, but at what cost? And the fact that the soldiers were shot at by FPV drones on their way back across the forest lines to the west. And based on that, we can see that the Russians are mainly advancing not down alongside the highway, but from the eastern flank through the forest lines. And if that is the case, then the Russians would be pushing down from the forest lines and into the town, which is likely mostly empty in the first place, considering the Ukrainians are holding the fortifications further north. And based on that, the Ukrainians would have re-entered Dobropilya from the western fortifications and forest lines from across the river with 3 infantry, planted the flag, taken some pictures, and then gone back and getting shot at on the way back based on context. I've not been finding any of these videos because most of them are released by specific units across the front line, many of them in closed channels. But what I do know is that the Russians are continuing the advances in the direction of Ivanivka, which indicates that there's no major Ukrainian counterattack. From the footage itself, it was also apparent that there was no fighting taking place. It was very empty, and Deep State Map is using that as the rhetoric, where they're saying, well, the Russians never captured it. We're just showing that we still own it. It's not even contested. It's not in the gray zone on Deep State Map's map. So we're seeing that this is also a propaganda move. If the Russians are already advancing further south, it makes sense that they wouldn't be fighting in an area that they thought they would have cleared. So in the end, conclusion is the Ukrainians were there. Whether they still hold positions there or not is unclear until we get further information. I'll leave that as a small gray zone within Dobropilya and the advance of the Russians further south. In the direction of Ivanivka, the Ukrainians re-entered Ivanivka through the cover of the fog with about a company-sized unit of about 100 soldiers. Then the Russians withdrew to the forest patch areas, organized a counterattack, brought in reinforcements, and they are also at about a company-sized strength now, and they managed to push the Ukrainians in a counterattack, where the Ukrainians then withdrew to the outskirts of the town, leaving the majority of the town in a gray zone. The Russians and the Ukrainians are present in some of the basements throughout the town, where they are shelling each other with artillery and drones, looking to inflict as many casualties as possible, and clearing building after building using grenades. So there's a lot of fighting within Ivanivka, but with a small amount of soldiers, about a company-sized unit on each side for this larger town. To the northeast of this, along the Pokrovsk and Minerat directions, the Russians continued advances along the road towards Hryshene, getting control of an additional pig farm and the fortifications along the northern flank of Pokrovsk, further strengthening their connection with Rodinsk further north and their control over the encirclement of Mindarat, where advances are also taking place to the southwest of Mindarat, gaining control over the railway line and pushing up towards the fortifications southwest of Mindarat towards the city itself, where the Ukrainians are now completely within the city itself and not present outside of it except for Svitli in the northwest, some of the industrial areas in the northwest, and the waste heap in the southeast. To the northeast of this, the Russians managed to gain control of additional parts of Sofiivka, gain control of the main residential areas and the crossing along the Toretsk River, where they're pushing the Ukrainians to the outskirts along the school area and the northern parts along the forest lines along the Toretsk River. The Russians almost have full control over Sofiivka, following which the Russians will likely expand their offensive operations on the western bank of the river line and in the direction of Novopavlivka, where they still have the flank of the fortifications under their control. A push from the eastern bank of the river line will risk Ukrainian counterattacks from the west, which is why the Russians would need to gain control over the quarries here to the northwest of Shahove to cover the western flank for offensive operations towards Toretsk and onwards along the fortifications. The Russians have reset offensive operations here in the direction of Shahove, where they are covering their offensives towards these quarries and other positions along the western flank here near the northern flank of Pokrovsk and Velyka. As for the Siversk section of the front line, the Russians continue to advance within the town of Pokrovsk, where they're pushing through the residential areas, gaining control over the eastern residential area, and the fighting is now in the central parts of the town along the southern flank of the fortifications here to the southwest of Siversk. Fighting also continues within Siversk, but it is only unlikely we'll get more footage from there or any confirmation/update from there as long as the fighting is ongoing, as there are very heavy fights between the Russians and the Ukrainians taking place within the town, and the positions switch hands every other day. To the northwest of this, the Russians continue offensive operations towards Dibrova, gaining a foothold within the northern outskirts of the town. According to Deep State Map, Ozerne is largely in the gray zone as well, which means the Russians are attacking both Dibrova and Ozerne to gain control over both towns and fortifications in between them, and align the front line with the Siversk River here along the highway between Lyman and Siversk, following which there is barely any resistance from the Ukrainians all the way to the highway to the southwest connecting to Sloviansk, which will allow the Russians to cut off all of the southern connections between the Ukrainian forces in Sloviansk and the positions within Lyman. Covering the southern flank will cut off the main supply lines across the Siversk River line. Then there is the western supply line where the footage comes to play. The Russians push through from Novopavlivka down along the forest patch area towards the eastern outskirts of Yarova, where fighting took place. The Ukrainians launched a counterattack to push the Russian forces out, which means that there is some sort of Russian presence here within the roads here to the south, which is an attempt by the Russians alongside their push through the forest patch area itself to cut off the supplies going through Sosnova and Yarova from the western flank, cutting off the supplies going towards Zaporizhzhia and Lyman from the west, while at the same time developing offensive operations on the eastern flank of Lyman down towards the southern flank to cut off the southern connection. The Russians are continuing their offensive operations to encircle Lyman completely from all directions. To the north of this, the Russians continue offensive operations along the Oskil River line, where they managed to gain control over the northern forest lines here along the eastern flank of Zaporizhzhia, push through to the southern residential area and the northern outskirts of Bohuslavka, pushing all the way to the central parts of the town. The Russians had previously attempted to gain a foothold within the southern parts of Bohuslavka. The Ukrainians in a counterattack managed to kick them out of the town and back into the forest lines to the south, where the Russians then launched their offensive operation from the north, gaining control over the northern flank and putting Novopavlivka in a operational encirclement and a push towards Bohuslavka to gain control over both towns in a combined push from the northern and southern directions. Russians are here working on getting control over the fortifications here along the northern flank of the defensive line outside of Novopavlivka, getting control over which will allow them to secure the northern flank of these positions, the eastern bank of the Oskil River line, and concentrate their forces along the fortifications here to the north of Novopavlivka and bypass the fortifications by gaining control over the town as well. By gaining control over the southern parts of Zaporizhzhia, the Russians also have a road into the forest patch areas, where they can push through these forest patch areas all the way to the rear of these fortifications. The defensive line here is a well-fortified area, several lines of fortifications, ranked lines, and so on. They are also located within the forest area itself, so it will be a difficult road. And as I presented in my previous video, the 2,000 meters to Ivanivka was 3 days of fighting. Well, this is a much wider area. There's a lot more infantry here, and it's way better fortified. So this is a much deadlier forest than that forest could ever be. To the northwest of this, the Ukrainians continue their counterattacks towards Kupiansk, regaining control over the southern outskirts of the city, as well as the forest patch areas in that direction. Most forested patch areas have reduced in effectiveness due to the weather conditions. We're now in December. That means all of the trees' leaves have fallen off. They do not provide as much cover as they used to, and this makes it difficult for infantry to take advantage of them to push through. However, the residential buildings is where the advantages lie, as the buildings do not wither in the winter. Then there is this area here in the central parts where Ukrainian DRGs are operating behind Russian lines. They're working on disrupting the logistics of the Russian forces operating in the southern parts of Kupiansk, combined with the Ukrainian counterattack here from the southern flank. They're pushing through the south and from the west at the same time. We're looking to converge at the central parts. A push by the Ukrainians along the highway and along the railway will allow them to cut off the connection to the southern parts of Kupiansk. So the Ukrainians are here working on changing some of their tactics used to the counterattack towards Kupiansk, as the counterattack has been ongoing for months and the Ukrainians have yet to recapture the town. But there is some progress taking place here over the end of November, start of December, which is allowing them to put more pressure on the logistics and supplies of the Russian forces. But again, the Russians are also developing the offensive operations on the eastern flank and holding their defenses within Kupiansk. So again, similar to the northern flank of Pokrovsk and Velyka, it is a race against time for both the Russians and the Ukrainians on who succeeds first. And considering the same happened north of Pokrovsk and Velyka that ended in an encirclement of Velyka, well, it is a very risky maneuver for the Ukrainians, but they need to take some of these risks, considering the fact that the battle of attrition is certainly not going their way. As for the Vovchansk direction, the Russians advanced here in the direction of Prilipka, gaining a foothold within the eastern parts of the town along the forest patch area, and advanced further down south along the town of Lyman, where they're continuing the battle within the town along the residential areas. The Russians continue offensive operations here on the western flank of Vovchansk, following the full capture of the town, and a push through Velyka to align the front line here to the southwest and advance along the Siversk and River line. And that's going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.